Beneath the indifferent gaze of a frost-laced moon, her skin etched the forbidden verses that no exile could silence. The wind howled through the jagged peaks of the Silverfang Mountains like a lament unheeded, carrying flakes of snow that stung like accusations against Alara's bare arms. She stumbled forward, her breath ragged clouds in the glacial air, each step a betrayal of the life she had known. The pack's verdict had been swift, merciless, a rejection carved not in words, but in the raw severance of bonds that once pulsed like her own heartbeat. Her alpha, Thorn, had claimed another, a fertile beta whose lineage promised strength where Alara's whispers of the old ways offered only shadows. "Useless seer!" they had snarled, their eyes gleaming with the fire of tradition's unyielding forge. Banished at the edge of the world, left to the mercy of the wilds, she was no longer Omega of the Frostvale Pack, but a ghost adrift in the endless white. Alara's fingers clutched the frayed edge of her woolen cloak, the fabric heavy with the damp chill that seeped into her bones. The snow crunched beneath her worn boots, a brittle symphony that mocked the silence of her solitude. She had always felt the pull of something deeper, a lunar hum in her veins that the elders dismissed as weakness. Visions flickered at the corners of her mind, fragments of ancient tongues, symbols that danced like fireflies in the dark. But they had branded her a curse, unfit for the pack's survival. Now, as the last light of dusk bled into the indigo veil of night, she sought refuge in the shadowed cradle of a pine grove where the trees stood like ancient sentinels, their branches bowed under mantles of ice. She collapsed against a gnarled trunk, the bark rough against her back, and drew her knees to her chest. The cold was a living thing, coiling around her like an unwanted lover, numbing the ache in her chest where the mate bond had been ripped away. Blood from a shallow cut on her palm, sustained in her frantic flight, dripped onto the snow, blooming into crimson stars that the wind scattered like forgotten prayers. Alara pressed her hand to her collarbone, where the skin tingled with an unfamiliar warmth. It had always been there, hidden beneath layers of modesty and denial, the markings. Not scars from birth or battle, but intricate swirls of silver-threaded ink that seemed to shift under moonlight, forming glyphs she could almost read. Her mother's last gift, whispered on a deathbed fever, had been a warning. "They are the words of the goddess, child. They will guide when all else fails." But guidance felt like mockery now, as the distant weevoo of wolves echoed through the valleys, a chorus that spoke of packs unbroken, alphas unchallenged. The moon climbed higher, its pale light filtering through the canopy in silvery shafts that painted the snow in ethereal glows. Alara tilted her head back, exposing her throat in instinctive surrender to the night, and felt the markings stir. A faint heat bloomed across her skin, tracing the curves of the script from her neck down her arms, hidden now beneath her sleeves, but alive with a pulse that matched the wind's mournful sigh. What strength was this, if it could not save her from exile? What mercy, if the goddess etched prophecies on a body deemed worthless? Tears froze on her lashes as she whispered to the empty air, "If destiny calls, why does it taste of blood and frost?" Hours blurred into a numb vigil. The fire she coaxed from damp twigs sputtered fitfully, its flames casting flickering shadows that danced like specters on the snow. The scent of pine resin mingled with the metallic tang of her blood, grounding her in the raw, sensorial tide of survival. She tore a strip from her cloak to bind the wound, the fabric absorbing the red like a vow unspoken. In the pack's halls, such marks would have been revered or feared. Here, they were her only companions, silent testaments to a heritage she could no longer claim. As the night deepened, the weevoo grew closer. Not the wild cries of untamed beasts, but something laced with pain, a guttural edge that spoke of pursuit or peril. Alara's heart quickened, her senses sharpening against the cold's dulling veil. The wind carried fragments, the snap of branches, the labored breath of something large and wounded. She doused the fire with a handful of snow, plunging the grove into moonlit obscurity, and pressed herself into the shadows. Fear coiled in her gut, mingling with a curiosity she could not quell. In the vast emptiness of her exile, was this the goddess's first verse unfolding? The markings on her skin warmed again, the glyphs seeming to hum with anticipation, as if the sacred text within her yearned to be read. Ilara held her breath, the world narrowing to the rhythm of her pulse and the encroaching unknown. Strength, she thought, was not the roar of the alpha, but the quiet choice to endure the storm. And in that moment, beneath the unyielding moon, she wondered if her banishment was not an end, but the shadowed prelude to a revelation etched in silver and blood. The shadows of the pine grove thickened as the howls fractured the night, a symphony of agony that clawed at Ilara's resolve. She crouched low, her bound hand throbbing in rhythm with her heart, the metallic scent of her blood mingling with the sharp resin of the evergreens. The moon hung like a watchful eye, its silver light slicing through the branches to illuminate patches of untouched snow, where her earlier footprints marred the pristine veil like accusations. Fear tasted of frost on her tongue, yet beneath it stirred an unwelcome curiosity, a pull, ancient and insistent, as if the markings on her skin whispered of fates entwined. The underbrush rustled violently, branches snapping like brittle bones under an unseen weight. Ilara's breath caught, her body tensing against the rough bark. A shape emerged from the gloom, massive, staggering, its silhouette etched against the lunar glow. He was no mere wolf of the wilds, but a man, or what remained of one, his form shifting in the haze of exhaustion and pain. Broad shoulders strained beneath a tattered cloak of dark fur, matted with snow and streaked with crimson. His hair, black as midnight ravens, fell in disheveled waves across a face carved from the mountains themselves. High cheekbones, shadowed by stubble, eyes like storm-tossed seas, flickering with a feral intensity. Blood seeped from a gash across his ribs, staining the snow in dark rivulets that steamed faintly in the cold. He moved with the grace of a predator felled, each step a labored defiance against collapse. Ilara's instincts screamed flight, but her limbs rooted to the earth, the glyphs beneath her sleeves igniting with a heat that bordered on burn. Who was he? Not of her pack. The scent was different, laced with the musk of ancient halls and iron-forged oaths, mingled with the acrid tang of betrayal. He paused, nostrils flaring, head lifting to scent the air. His gaze locked onto her hiding place, piercing the shadows with an alpha's unerring precision. For a heartbeat, the world stilled. The wind held its breath, the distant wee-voo faded to echoes, and in that suspended silence, Ilara felt it, an instinctive tether, raw and electric, coiling from her core to his. It was the Omega's curse and gift, the unspoken recognition of a kindred wound, yet she denied it fiercely, rationalizing it as mere survival's illusion. Fear curdled into wariness, curiosity sharpened into suspicion. What peril did he bring to her fragile exile? He growled low, a sound that vibrated through the frozen ground, not threat, but plea, as he slumped against a nearby trunk. His hand pressed to the wound, fingers slick with blood, and he scanned the darkness with eyes that held not conquest, but a profound, haunted weariness. "Show yourself," he rasped, voice like gravel under boot, edged with the authority of one born to command, yet broken by its cost. "I mean no harm. Not to the innocent." Innocent. The word stung, a mockery of her banishment. Ilara hesitated, the cold seeping deeper into her bones, urging her toward the unknown warmth of connection. Against her better judgment, she stepped forward, cloak parting to reveal the pale curve of her neck, where the moonlight caught the faint shimmer of her markings. His eyes widened fractionally, not in lust or dominance, but in a flicker of recognition that bordered on reverence. He straightened slightly, wincing, and extended a bloodied hand, not in demand, but in offering. You're no ghost of these woods. Help me, and perhaps the goddess will repay the mercy. She approached warily, the snow muffling her steps, her own bloodied palm aching in sympathy. Up close, he was a ruin of royalty. The cloak bore the faded emblem of a crescent moon entwined with thorns, insignia of the Silver Fang throne, whispered in pack legends as the realm of kings who ruled with iron ethics and shadowed regrets. King Draven, she realized with a jolt, exiled in tales, marked by the guilt of a war that claimed his mate and scarred his soul. Rumors spoke of his flight from treacherous betas who coveted his crown, a curse of isolation that twisted his once unyielding strength into melancholic solitude. Why here, in her forsaken grove? The markings pulsed hotter, as if the sacred text yearned to bridge the chasm between them. Ilara knelt at a safe distance, tearing another strip from her cloak to fashion a makeshift bandage. Her fingers brushed his skin as she worked, unintended, electric, and a shiver passed through them both, instinctive and denied. "Mercy is a fool's currency in these mountains," she murmured, her voice steady despite the storm within. Fear warred with the curiosity that drew her closer, rationalizing the bond as pity for a fallen king. His touch was fevered, the heat of his wound contrasting the glacial air, and she caught the scent of him, pine smoke, aged leather, and the deep coppery bloom of blood that echoed her own. Draven watched her, his breath ragged, eyes tracing the hidden lines beneath her sleeves with a hunger not of the body, but of the spirit. Those marks. They hum like the old verses. I've sought translators for the sacred texts, scoured ruins for one who could decipher the goddess's will. But you? He trailed off, guilt etching deeper lines into his face, as if voicing the thought profaned it. The connection stirred uneasily, instinct urging acceptance, duty and pain demanding rejection. He pulled back slightly, denying the pull as she did, his ethical core recoiling from imposing his burdens on another exile. The wind picked up, carrying the faint clamor of pursuers, Weevu laced with malice, the crunch of boots on snow. Ilara's heart raced. Curiosity had birthed necessity. "They're coming for you," she said, tying off the bandage with hands that trembled not from cold alone. Blood from his wound soaked the fabric, mingling with traces of hers, a symbolic union under the moon's indifferent gaze. Draven nodded, rising unsteadily, his hand lingering near hers in silent alliance. "Then we run together, for now. Strength is not in solitude, but in choosing the shadow that shields." The words hung between them, a philosophical tether amid the encroaching threat. Ilara met his eyes, the instinctive bond flickering like firelight, feared, questioned, yet undeniable. As they melted into the deeper woods, the markings on her skin warmed with promise and peril, the sacred text awakening to a destiny neither could yet embrace. And now, I invite you to leave a trace of your presence in the comments. Tell us where in the world you're watching from, and the exact hour you hear this story. We wish to know how far these northern confessions travel, and at what moments of the night they find you. The snow-laden pines blurred into a white-veiled labyrinth as Ilara and Draven plunged deeper into the woods, their breaths sinking in ragged harmony against the onslaught of the wind. Her boots sank into drifts that clutched like desperate hands, each step pulling at the frayed edges of her resolve. The markings on her skin thrummed beneath her cloak, a living script that seemed to map the path ahead, silver lines glowing faintly against the chill that clawed at her flesh. Fear had forged this uneasy alliance. But as the distant clamor of pursuers swelled, harsh shouts mingling with the snap of crossbows through the trees, curiosity twisted into something sharper, a reluctant empathy for the king who ran not as conqueror, but as one haunted by shadows of his own making. Draven led, his wounded frame belying the Alpha's innate command, his bloodied hand gesturing her toward a narrow ravine where the mountain's bones jutted like forgotten altars. The air grew thicker here, laced with the mineral tang of damp stone and the faint, acrid bite of sulfur from hidden hot springs. "This way," he growled over his shoulder, voice laced with the gravel of pain, yet steady as the ancient oaths he once swore. Ilara followed, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm that echoed the weevoo of the wind, the metallic scent of his blood mingling with hers on the breeze, a crimson thread binding their flight. She rationalized it still, not destiny, but necessity, a momentary shield against the betas who hunted him for the throne he could no longer claim. Yet the instinctive pull tugged at her core, denied but insistent, like the moon's gravity on the tide. They descended into the ravine, the walls rising sheer and glistening with ice that caught the moonlight in fractured prisms. Draven stumbled once, his knee buckling against a root hidden beneath the snow, and Ilara caught his arm without thinking, her fingers brushing the taut muscle beneath his cloak, sending a jolt through them both. Heat flared where they touched, not fever alone, but the spark of recognition, the Omega's bond whispering of wounds that mirrored her own. He straightened, eyes meeting hers in the dim glow, a flicker of guilt shadowing their storm-gray depths. "You need not bear my burdens," he murmured, the words heavy with the melancholy of a king who had lost everything to duty's cruel forge. But she saw it then, the ethical core that had spared innocence in wars long past, now fraying under the weight of betrayal. Empathy stirred unbidden, softening the edges of her wariness. He was no tyrant, but a man marked by choices that echoed her rejection. The ravine opened into a shallow cave, its mouth veiled by icicles like jagged teeth, the interior warmed by a geothermal trickle that steamed against the frost. They slipped inside, Draven barring the entrance with a fallen boulder that groaned under his effort, his breath coming in labored bursts. Ilara pressed against the damp wall, the stone's chill seeping through her cloak, contrasting the faint warmth radiating from the earth below. The cave smelled of moss and minerals, a sanctuary carved by time's indifferent hand, lit only by the moon's pale intrusion through cracks above. She watched him slump to the ground, peeling back his cloak to reveal the gash across his ribs, deep, ragged, weeping fresh blood that pooled on the uneven floor like spilled ink from a sacred quill. Kneeling beside him, Ilara tore the last clean strip from her hem, her hands steady despite the tremor in her chest. The pursuers' voices echoed faintly outside, a guttural chant of vengeance from the betas who had poisoned his court, their arrows whispering against the wind like accusations. "They won't find us here," she said softly, binding the wound with careful precision, her fingers grazing the hard planes of his abdomen. The contact ignited the markings again, the glyphs shifting subtly, as if translating the pain into verses of endurance. Draven's hand covered hers briefly, not in dominance, but in gratitude, a touch that lingered, electric, and resisted. "You've given a fallen king refuge," he said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through the stone. "In my halls, such mercy would be sung in ballads, yet I bring only peril to your exile." She met his gaze, the cave's shadows carving hollows in his face, revealing the guilt that etched deeper than any scar, the loss of his mate to a rival's blade, the war he waged for peace that claimed too many souls. Empathy bloomed fully now, transforming curiosity into a fragile bond, for in his haunted eyes she saw her own rejection reflected, not weakness, but the cost of a world that prized power over the heart's quiet strength. "Peril found me long before you," Ilara replied, her voice threading with the philosophy that had sustained her through banishment. "What is refuge, if not two shadows sharing the same storm? The goddess does not reward the strong alone, but those who choose compassion amid the blood. Outside, The wind howled a warning as footsteps crunched perilously close, the beta's torches flickering like malevolent stars against the ravine's edge. Draven rose, positioning himself between Alara and the entrance, his body a shield forged from duty and regret. She stood beside him, not behind, her hand instinctively finding the dagger at her belt, a relic from her pack days, now a symbol of her reclaimed agency. Together, they listened as the intruders passed, their curses fading into the night, thwarted by the mountain's labyrinth. In that shared silence, the bond deepened, no longer mere instinct, but a choice. Empathy weaving through the fear, turning strangers into allies under the moon's watchful light. The steam from the spring curled around them like incense, carrying the faint scent of healing earth. Draven turned to her, his expression softening from the king's mask to something raw, vulnerable. Those markings, they call to me, like echoes of the texts I've chased across forgotten ruins. But it's not the words, it's you. The translator the goddess hid in plain sight. Alara's breath caught, the glyphs warming in response. But she pulled back slightly, rationalizing the pull as the cave's illusion. Yet the bond held, a visceral thread of emotion that promised more than survival, redemption, perhaps, born from the refuge they had carved in stone and shadow. As the night wore on, the cave became their fragile haven, the blood on the floor drying into dark constellations that mirrored the stars above. Alara leaned against the wall, exhaustion tugging at her limbs, while Draven kept vigil, his presence a quiet anchor. The wind outside softened to a whisper, but the dilemma lingered. In protecting each other, had they awakened a destiny neither could deny? Strength, she mused, was not the Alpha's roar, but the mercy that bound two exiles in the heart of the storm. And beneath the indifferent moon, the sacred text on her skin began to unfold, verse by verse, in the warmth of their shared silence. The steam from the hidden spring coiled lazily through the cave, weaving ethereal threads that caught the moonlight like silken veils, softening the jagged edges of stone and shadow. Alara sat with her back against the damp wall, the chill seeping through her cloak like a persistent whisper of doubt, while the warmth from Draven's proximity radiated against her side, a counterpoint that both soothed and unsettled. The dried blood on the floor had crusted into dark, irregular patterns, resembling the fractured runes she had glimpsed in forbidden scrolls during her pack's rare lunar vigils. Her hand, still bound from the night's earlier wound, throbbed faintly, a reminder that survival demanded more than instinct. It required the unraveling of secrets long buried beneath skin and shame. Draven shifted beside her, his breath steadying as the fever of his injury ebbed under the earth's subtle healing. The cave's air hung heavy with the scent of mineral-rich water and the faint, coppery residue of blood, mingling with the pine musk that clung to his fur-lined cloak. He had stripped it partially away to tend the bandage, revealing the broad expanse of his chest, scarred not just by the fresh gash, but by older marks, pale lines from battles waged in the name of a throne that now hunted him like a pariah. His eyes, shadowed by the weight of unspoken regrets, fixed on her with a quiet intensity that pierced the dimness. The silence here. "It's a rare mercy," he murmured, his voice a low timbre that resonated through the stone, carrying the melancholy of a king who had commanded armies yet failed to safeguard his own heart. Guilt etched his features, the lines deepening as memories surfaced. The mate he had lost to treachery, the war he had ended only to ignite a deeper fracture in his realm. Alara met his gaze, her own heart a tumult of resisted pulls, the instinctive bond that hummed like a distant uivo, rationalized as the cave's confining illusion, yet undeniable in its visceral tug. The markings on her skin stirred anew, a subtle heat tracing from her collarbone down her arms, as if awakening to the proximity of one who might finally read their language. She had always sensed their power, dismissed by her pack as a seer's folly, But here, in this sanctuary forged from peril, they felt alive, insistent. "Mercy is fleeting in these mountains," she replied softly, her words laced with the philosophy that had armored her through exile. "It binds us, but at what cost? Your pursuers will return, and my banishment was meant to end me alone." Fear lingered in her chest, cold as the frost outside, but curiosity had evolved into a fragile trust, empathy bridging the chasm between their wounds. As the moon climbed toward its zenith, its light intensified through the ceiling's fissures, bathing the cave in a silvery luminescence that danced across the walls like liquid mercury. Alara felt the shift before she saw it, a deepening warmth spreading across her skin, the glyphs igniting with an inner fire that made her gasp. She clutched her cloak tighter, but the fabric could not contain the manifestation. The markings emerged, shimmering through the thin weave, silver lines unfurling like vines in spring, forming intricate verses that pulsed with ethereal light. The air grew charged, humming with an ancient energy that raised the hairs on her arms and filled the cave with the faint scent of ozone and wild herbs. Visions of lunar temples, forgotten by time. Draven's breath hitched, his body tensing as he leaned closer, eyes widening, not in alarm, but in profound awe. The light from her skin illuminated his face, casting the scars into stark relief, and for the first time, the king's melancholic veil cracked, revealing a soul stripped bare. "By the goddess," he whispered, reverence threading his voice like a prayer long withheld. He reached out tentatively, his blood-stained fingers hovering near her arm, not touching, but tracing the air above the glowing script. The verses shifted under his gaze, rearranging into coherent phrases, ancient invocations of redemption, prophecies of a fallen crown reclaimed through mercy's blade. "These are the words, the sacred text I've sought across ruins and shadowed archives. Translators failed, scrolls crumbled to dust, but you bear them etched in flesh, alive and speaking." Alara's heart raced, the revelation crashing over her like a winter avalanche, cold terror mingled with a blooming certainty that her exile had been no curse, but a path to this moment. The glyphs warmed further, projecting faint illusions onto the cave wall, visions of a throne room awash in blood, a king's silhouette bowed in guilt, and a silver-marked figure extending a hand of forgiveness. She felt the power surge through her veins, a donna culto manifesting not as vague visions, but as a bridge to destiny's core. Pain lanced her chest, the emotional weight of her pack's rejection twisting anew. They had cast her out for this gift, fearing what they could not control. Tears welled, hot against the cave's chill, as she whispered, "It's always been there, hidden like a shame. But why me? Why now with you?" Draven's hand finally brushed her sleeve, gentle as a falling snowflake, and the contact amplified the glow, the verses aligning into a prophecy clear as moonlight. "The wounded king shall find his tongue in the exile's skin, where blood and mercy forge the broken crown." His ethical resolve, once a barrier against vulnerability, shattered in that instant. Guilt flooded his eyes, the wars he had fought, the mate whose death haunted his dreams, the throne poisoned by betrayal. "You are the key," he said, voice breaking with the raw emotion of realization. "The goddess hid you not to punish, but to redeem. My flight was no accident. It led me here, to the one who deciphers not just words, but the wounds we carry. I've borne this curse alone, believing duty demanded isolation. But strength, what is it, if not yielding to the light that heals?" The visions faded as abruptly as they had come, leaving the cave in hushed afterglow, the steam curling thicker now, scented with the faint bloom of night flowers that bloomed only under full moons. Ilara pulled back slightly, the bond surging stronger, no longer deniable but a force that demanded reckoning. Fear warred with empowerment. This gift made her vital, yet vulnerable, tying her fate to a king's shadowed path. Outside, a lone weevo pierced the night, perhaps a wild wolf, or a harbinger of the beta's return, reminding them that revelation came laced with peril. Draven's gaze held hers, melancholic yet ignited with purpose, the alpha's duty intertwining with a deeper call, to protect not just his realm, but the Omega who embodied its salvation. In that suspended breath, Alara felt the sacred text settle, its warmth a promise and a burden. The moon watched indifferently, its light pooling like spilled silver on the bloodied floor, as the dilemma crystallized. To embrace this destiny meant risking everything for redemption's fragile flame, or to flee back into exile's numb embrace. What was faith, if not choosing the verses written on one's own skin, even when they demanded the heart's surrender? Comment Luna if you'd walk through the storm for someone who saw your worth. The moon's zenith cast a merciless silver pall over the ravine, turning the snow into a frozen mirror that reflected the encroaching dawn's first blush. Alara's breath came in shallow bursts as she and Draven emerged from the cave's shadowed womb, the night's fragile peace shattered by the thunder of hooves and the sharp tang of torch smoke drifting on the wind. Her markings still hummed faintly beneath her skin, a residual warmth that felt less like gift and more like a brand, pulling her inexorably toward the confrontation she had dreaded since her exile. The glyphs had revealed too much, prophecies of crowns reforged in mercy, of kings redeemed by the outcast's light. And now, with the beta's clamor swelling like a storm, that revelation demanded action, not whispers. Draven moved ahead, his form a silhouette of coiled tension, the bandage across his ribs darkening with fresh seepage as he gripped the hilt of a concealed dagger. The air was alive with peril, the crunch of boots on ice, the low snarls of shifted wolves circling the ravine's rim, their eyes gleaming like embers in the gloom. Alara's heart pounded, a visceral drumbeat that echoed the weevu rising from the valley below, her pack's distant call, twisted now by the beta's alliance with Thorn, her former alpha, whose betrayal had cast her into this abyss. Rumors had reached even the wilds. Thorn's ambition had forged pacts with Draven's traitors, a web of politics where rejects like her were pawns, and kings like him were prizes to be claimed or slain. They crested a ridge, the wind whipping Alara's cloak like a banner of defiance, carrying the metallic bite of blood from Draven's wound and the acrid reek of unwashed fur from the approaching horde. Below, in a clearing ringed by jagged pines, the confrontation unfolded like a ritual under the fading moon. Torches flared to life, their flames dancing wildly against the snow, illuminating a cluster of figures. Betas clad in iron-laced leathers, their faces twisted with the fervor of usurpers, flanked by Thorn's enforcers from the Frostvale pack. Wolves she had once called kin, their eyes cold with the judgment that had banished her. At their center stood Kale, the alpha rival who had slain Draven's mate years ago, his frame hulking and scarred, a crown of thorns woven into his mane like a mockery of royalty. He was the traitor incarnate, the one whose poisoned whispers had fractured Draven's court, allying now with Thorn for a shared throne built on exile's ruins. Draven halted at the ridge's edge, his body a barrier between Alara and the fray, but she stepped forward, the markings igniting with a fierce glow that pierced her sleeves like starlight through cloud. The wind howled a lament, tugging at her hair and exposing the silver script that curled across her throat, a living testament to the sacred text that had drawn them here. "Draven," she whispered, her voice threading fear with resolve, the cold air burning her lungs as empathy warred with the raw ache of her past. He turned, his storm-gray eyes meeting hers, guilt etching deeper furrows into his face. The king who had borne wars for peace now faced the architect of his deepest loss, and in her, the potential salvation he both craved and feared to claim. Kale's laugh boomed across the clearing, a guttural challenge that silenced the wind momentarily. The fallen king and his stray Omega, He sneered, his voice like grinding stone, eyes raking over Ilara with dismissive hunger. "You've run far, Draven, but the throne calls you back, to kneel or die. And you, Seerkin, your pack disowns you still. Thorn here assures me your whispers are poison, unfit for any bond." Thorn stepped from the shadows, his familiar frame bulkier now with beta alliances, his gaze sliding over Ilara like a blade, regret flickering briefly before hardening into ambition. The rejection stung anew, a phantom pain in her chest where the mate bond had been severed, blood from her unbound palm dripping onto the snow in crimson blooms that the moon turned to rubies. Draven's hand tightened on his dagger, his ethical core fracturing under the weight of vengeance. He had sworn oaths of mercy after his mate's death, yet here stood her killer, taunting the redemption he sought. "This ends tonight," he growled, the words laced with melancholic fury, his body shifting partially, claws extending as the alpha's instinct surged. But Ilara placed a hand on his arm. The contact electric, her markings flaring brighter and projecting faint verses into the air, glyphs of forgiveness weaving through the torchlight like spectral threads. The betas recoiled, murmuring of curses, while Thorn's eyes widened in recognition of the power her pack had feared. The clash erupted in visceral chaos. Wolves lunged from the shadows, fangs bared and claws raking the snow into bloody furrows. Draven met Kale head-on, their forms colliding with the force of mountains grinding, blood spraying in arcs that steamed against the frost. Ilara dodged a beta's swipe, her dagger flashing in the firelight, the wind carrying the coppery scent of wounds and the guttural snarls that blended with distant weevo. Thorn circled her, his breath hot and ragged. "You were always too soft, Ilara. Visions over strength. Join us or die as the exile you are." His words clawed at her soul, offering freedom and submission, a return to the pack that had broken her, but without the love she now glimpsed in Draven's shadowed glances. As Draven grappled Kale, pinning him against a pine with a roar that shook the earth, Ilara faced her choice amid the fray. The markings burned, verses unfolding in her mind. Mercy crowns the blade that spares, war devours the heart that wields. Love or freedom, Draven's bond pulled at her core, resisted no longer but a flame she could fan into union, or she could flee into the wilds, reclaiming solitude over the peril of destiny. Thorn lunged, but she sidestepped, her dagger grazing his arm, drawing blood that mingled with hers on the snow, a symbolic severance. "Strength is choosing compassion," she cried, the philosophy born of her exile now a weapon, as the glyphs projected a vision. Kale's fall, not in death, but in submission. Draven's crown reclaimed through forgiveness, not slaughter. Draven hesitated, his claws at Kale's throat, guilt and duty clashing in his eyes as he glanced at Ilara, the Omega whose skin bore his path to redemption. The rival whimpered, the horde faltering under the lunar glow that amplified her light. In that suspended heartbeat, amid the blood-slicked snow and flickering torches, Ilara made her moral stand. "End it with mercy, Draven, not for him, but for the king you can become. War takes everything. Forgiveness rebuilds from the ashes." The wind stilled, the moon bearing witness as Draven withdrew his claws, binding Kale with ropes from the fallen betas, Thorn slinking back into the shadows with a final haunted look, defeated not by force, but by the choice of compassion over conquest. The clearing fell silent, save for labored breaths and the crackle of dying flames, blood pooling in dark constellations under the paling sky. Draven turned to her, his face a map of exhaustion and awe, the bond solidifying in the quiet aftermath, a love accepted not as reward, but as the hard-won proof of their shared wounds. Yet doubt lingered in Ilara's chest, the ethical dilemma unresolved. Had mercy freed them, or merely delayed the war's true cost? As the first rays of dawn pierced the horizon, staining the snow in gold and red, She wondered if Renascimento awaited, or if freedom demanded one final sacrifice beneath the indifferent moon. The first light of dawn crept over the Silverfang peaks like a hesitant promise, gilding the bloodied snow in hues of rose and amber, where the night's violence lay, etched in crimson furrows and scattered embers. Ilara stood amid the clearing's wreckage, her breath misting in the crisp air that carried the fading tang of smoke and iron, remnants of torches quenched and wounds sealed by reluctant mercy. The wind had softened to a murmur, whispering through the pines as if mourning the choices that had reshaped the frost-kissed earth. Her markings, dimmed now to a subtle silver sheen beneath her torn sleeves, pulsed with a quiet rhythm, no longer a blaze of revelation, but a steady undercurrent, like the heartbeat of the goddess herself, affirming the path they had forged. Draven knelt by the bound Kale, his hands steady as he checked the ropes woven from scavenged cloaks, the traitor's form slumped against a tree trunk, eyes hollow with defeat rather than death. The Alpha's frame, still taut from the fray, bore fresh gashes that wept thin trails of blood, staining the snow at his feet in dark, symbolic petals. Guilt shadowed his features, not for the mercy granted, but for the years it had eluded him. The wars that had claimed his mate, the throne poisoned by ambition, leaving him a king in exile, hollowed by duty's unyielding weight. He rose slowly, turning to Ilara with eyes that held the storm's aftermath. Profound weariness mingled with a nascent light, the melancholic veil lifting to reveal the man beneath the crown's burden. She met his gaze, the instinctive bond no longer a resisted whisper, but a resonant truth woven through the fabric of their shared ordeal. The rejection from her pack echoed faintly now, a scar softened by the night's trials. Thorn's retreat into the shadows, a final severance, his ambition crumbling under the weight of what he had discarded. Yet freedom tugged at her still, a wild call to vanish into the mountain's embrace, to reclaim solitude over the peril of entanglement. The glyphs on her skin warmed gently, tracing verses of union across her collarbone. In the exile's light, the broken crown heals, not through blade, but through the heart's quiet yield. Love was no reward here, but redemption's proof, a choice born of suffering, demanding sacrifice of the self's isolation for the healing of another's wound. Draven approached, his steps measured on the crusted snow, the faint crunch under his boots a cadence to the dawn's unfolding. The air between them hummed with unspoken philosophy, the scent of pine resin and cooling blood grounding the moment in raw sensorial truth. He extended a hand, not in command, but in offering, calloused fingers marked by old scars, the same hand that had spared Kale's life, choosing compassion over the vengeance that had haunted his dreams. "The battle's end is not victory," he said, his voice a low rumble laced with ethical introspection. "But the dawn that follows. You've given me sight, Ilara, not just the words on your skin, but the mercy to see beyond my guilt. My throne awaits, fractured but reclaimable, yet without you. It remains a shadow." Ilara's heart clenched, the cold wind brushing her cheeks like a lover's hesitant touch, carrying distant wivu that blended wolf and spirit in harmonious release. The markings flared briefly, projecting no visions now, but a warmth that seeped into her veins, illuminating the dilemma. To bind herself to this king meant forsaking the wild freedom of her exile, offering her gift as the bridge to his realm's rebirth, a union that healed not just him, but the fractures of her own soul. Sacrifice loomed, leaving behind the numb independence that had sustained her, risking the pack's lingering scorn or the beta's vengeful return. Yet in his eyes she saw her worth reflected, not as a seer cursed, but as the pathfinder whose verses mended what power alone could not. She placed her hand in his, the contact electric yet tender, skin to skin sending ripples through the glyphs that glowed softly, silver light dancing across their joined palms like moonlight on fresh snow. blood from his fresh wounds mingled with the faint residue on her own, a visceral seal under the paling moon, now yielding to the sun's ascent. "Strength is not enduring alone," she whispered, her voice threading the philosophy that had carried her through rejection's storm, "but choosing the wound that mirrors your own and healing it with faith over fear. I've been adrift, marked by words no one read until you. If destiny writes us together, let it be through choice, not chains. I'll stand with you, Draven, not as Omega to King, but as the voice that deciphers the heart's true text." He drew her closer, his free arm encircling her waist with a gentleness born of profound respect, the heat of his body a bulwark against the dawn's chill. The bond solidified in that embrace resisted no more, a love accepted as the ultimate redemption, proof of their renascimento amid the blood and frost. Kyle stirred faintly, bound and broken, a living testament to mercy's crown. The Beta's torches lay extinguished, their horde scattered like leaves in the wind. The mountains seemed to exhale, the pines straightening under the light, as if the land itself acknowledged the shift, from war's tragedy to a spiritual union forged in ethical fire. They turned from the clearing, hand in hand, ascending the ridge toward the hidden paths that led to Draven's fractured realm. The snow crunched softly beneath their steps, the wind now a gentle ally, carrying the promise of fires rekindled in lunar temples and castles of ice thawed by compassion's flame. Ilara felt the markings settle, their silver script a map not of exile, but of home, etched in her skin, but alive in the destiny they would rebuild together. What was rebirth, if not the heart's surrender to the light within another's gaze? Beneath the moon's fading vigil, as the sun crested fully, painting the world in gold, they walked into the horizon, two souls redeemed, the sacred text unfolding verse by verse into eternity. The distant wivu rose in celebration, a chorus for the fallen who rose, and in that symphony of wind and light, Ilara knew. Every Omega was born to heal a king's wound, and every king to read the redemption written on her soul. If your heart beat alongside ours, like, comment, and subscribe. Because every soul that joins our moon keeps the flame of redemption alive.